Hi, welcome to Module 2 of our Stress Management Self-Coaching series. Today we are talking about measurements of stress. Heart rate variability, that's been one of the big terms that's being thrown around out there. What it is heart rate variability is the variation in time that a heartbeat takes. So from one beat to the other, how many milliseconds does the entire cycle of the cardiac cycle take? What it's useful for is telling us, are we spending too much time in fight or flight mode, or are we able to shift into rest and digest mode? It's a measurement essentially of how well balanced our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system is, because we want it to be this flexible exchange, like a seesaw more or less, that parasympathetic dominates when we're in recovery, sympathetic dominates when we are under stress or duress. What we find is when we are on a high chronic level of stress, our heart rate variability diminishes significantly. It tells us we don't have a lot of balance in our nervous system, and consistently low heart rate variability says, hey, we're not adapting well to stress and we're not recovering well from it. It's usually manifest in things we can see in our life, like poor sleep quality. Overworking tends to cause it, and also tends to be a response to it. As we feel more stressed, we work harder instead of taking a break. Feeling emotionally depleted, just can't even. Many of us experience that coming home from a shift. Feeling that tired and wired, where our adrenaline has dropped off, but our cortisol has stayed high. So we're exhausted, but we can't shut down. We can't go into relaxation because the sympathetic nervous system's still on overdrive. Having that chronically low heart rate variability sets us up to be more likely to have insomnia, to develop heart disease. Even things like anxiety and depression are associated with low chronic heart rate variability. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a buzzword anymore. And fortunately, there are a lot of tools out there that allow us to track that. But that is a really good clinical metric for how well am I regulating my stress. Subjective measures, and usually it's not even us telling us this, it's our family members seeing these for us.
And there's a bunch. I mean, the subjective measures are more, the outward response of what people see when our heart rate variability is reduced. But anger and rage, decreased patience, poor sleep, ultimate decreased relationship quality, burnout, and even really some compassion fatigue. And I also think that, when you're completely wiped, you have that sensation of, sitting maybe at your workstation or in your car or wherever it is you are, and your brain's just not working. You read something and you have to reread it 10 times because you can't really grasp it, or you head off walking down the hall, you're going on an important mission, and you get there and you don't know what you're doing. So you backtrack hoping that something will trigger the memory, but everything is just it's not working together. So there are a lot of subjective measures. And I think oftentimes too, we don't listen to family who identify those subjective measures. So being able to pay attention to them when they notice some of this stuff and they're not just picking at you, I think is also really important. They can kind of be our bookmarks.
Well, and it's important to recognize that these things, they're not necessarily criticisms, they're not weaknesses, and they're not character flaws. These are signs that we are going into a chronically stressed state. We're coming out of the executive functioning of the brain. We're dropping down into areas of the brain that have less capacity for dealing with complexity. And life these days is really complex. So these are signs that, hey, something's wrong. Just like when you go to the gym and you lift a weight and all of a sudden something feels off. You don't just keep doing it and keep pushing and try to go heavier. You recognize something's off with that muscle. You take time to rest and recover and to get yourself back to full strength. These are the signs that we're becoming stress injured. One of the things we see that's prevalent, especially in the healthcare community now, is burnout and compassion fatigue. Healthcare workers have been called to step up just en masse and do so much more with so much less. Oftentimes over the past 18 months, we find that our self-care practices went by the wayside. Maybe we didn't recognize it, whether it was going to the gym, going to sporting events, live music, having downtime with family, not having overtime, mandatory overtime. And when those things go away, when we don't get that rest and that recovery, it really decreases our capacity to deal with this work, even if it's work that we love.
And those things have to be as critical as taking your heart medication, taking your insulin for diabetics. It has to be a part of your regime to live. I mean, and being able to make sure that we're paying attention to this stuff and we're taking care of ourselves. And we're going to talk a little bit too in consequent modules about, all of the compassion fatigue and ways that we can also manipulate some things around where we have a little bit more compassion satisfaction, which can help combat some of this as well.
And can you talk a little bit more about compassion satisfaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for years, we always we talk a lot about trauma injury and stress injury and how bad it is. They talk about PTSD and all of the negative things that come with our places of employment and all the stressors that we accrue. And obviously you are sitting here listening to an entire module on stress. But I think that what's really important, I don't think you can teach about stress and trauma injury without talking about the benefits and also the good things that can come from the line of work that you're in. And there are benefits. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes we've got to dig backhoe deep to identify some of those because we're so overwhelmed with so much of negative. But there is this balance. As much as we talk about balancing the system, we also have to balance our perspective so that we don't end up really fueling a negative neural bias, and that our brain is able to scan the world for things that are still good, because believe it or not, there are still things that are good. And a lot of times if we place our perspective in those locations, we practice some of the mindfulness meditations, and I'm not talking fluffy stuff because I know you won't do it. I'm talking really good stuff. We'll hit on a little inconsequent modules. But when we're able to do some of that, it really helps with our heart, our recovery, our sleep, our the things we choose to focus on will have heavy impacts on all of the stuff that we're talking about. So as much as there's compassion fatigue, there's also a significant amount of satisfaction in the jobs that we do, knowing that we get to be there during very critical events for other humans, knowing that we get to serve in a way that other people won't or potentially can't or don't want to.
Well, and I think one of the big things that I've seen across the country from doctors, from nurses, from emergency responders, and from leaders of all of those groups is this kind of existential fear. I got into this work because I loved it. I got into this work because I wanted to help people, and now I don't love this work anymore. I have fatigue in everything. I have compassion fatigue. I'm burned out. I don't know why I'm doing this. My family doesn't understand why I'm doing this. And that, I think, is really damaging and destructive. And what we want to deliver through this message is that doesn't mean you're in the wrong work. It doesn't mean you can't do it anymore. It means you have a chronically elevated stress response. It means you need to really step up and do what it takes to get yourself balanced so that your nervous system is back in balance, and then make a decision from that point. Right now, you're in a place of extreme duress when you're feeling that extreme burnout and that compassion fatigue. It doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. You can love this work again, but to get to that point, you've got to do the things. And it's different for each of us. I mean, there's general guidelines. There are universal things that help all of us, but we'll talk a lot more in the subsequent modules about how to figure out what works for you specifically and what's going to get you back on track to a place where you can make a better decision.
Yeah. Well, and to a place where you feel better, because when you physically feel better, you will also think better. Your thinking becomes more clear and more clean, and you're able to identify more positive aspects of your world and what it is that you do. The pride that you take in your work, all of that, you'll be able to identify that a little bit more when all of the stress chemistry, the exhaustion, the depletion in serotonin levels, the high, adrenaline and cortisol levels aren't the ones that are thinking for you.
Exactly.
So when you have better balance, you can see things better and more clearly as well. You don't ever want to make like a huge life decision when you're at your worst, when you feel horrible, when you're good and mad, when you're whatever. You really want to take care of it. You want to downregulate. You want to make sure that you feel good and then make that decision. And so, but all of those self-care measures are so critically important.
Right.
Really to even being able to utilize some of the resiliency strategies.
And we'll talk more about that in other modules. So thanks very much for your time.